Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into AI translation. It's pretty fascinating, sometimes a little unsettling,
Yeah,
but
it can be.
really gets you thinking about how AI can actually shape meaning, especially when it comes to those languages that, well, they don't always get the spotlight.
Yeah, they're not always in the mainstream.
Right.
Yeah.
And, today we're going to uncover some surprising things about how AI translation actually works. And we'll be looking at some of the risks it poses, especially for these marginalized languages.
I think you'll find it pretty intriguing.
Definitely.
Yeah, because we often think of translation as just like, swapping out words.
Right, right.
But as we're going to see, it's actually way more complex
Oh, yeah, for sure.
when AI gets involved.
Absolutely. Our main source today is this really eye-opening article from the outside, and it's titled, When Translation is Actually Prediction and Why That's a Bad Thing. And the author uses a case study about Scots Gaelic to show just how much AI can get things wrong.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The article starts with the author trying to translate a Scots Gaelic phrase, and it's "Tha bear amolad a bunchard."
Uh,
And they fully expected it to translate to "the work praises the craftswoman."
okay.
But the AI had something else in mind.
Okay, I'm hooked now. What did the AI come up with?
It translated the phrase as "the work praises the female smith."
Female smith instead of craftswoman. I mean, is that really such a big difference?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. You see, the AI, in this case ChatGPT, didn't just mistranslate. It actually made an assumption
Hmm.
based on, well, I guess you could call it historical baggage.
Oh, okay.
That might not have been what the author meant at all.
Hmm. I see. I see what you mean. Yeah. So, changing craftswoman to female smith kind of suggests a very, very specific and maybe even biased understanding of the word seared. I mean, couldn't you also say that even human translators, they draw on real world knowledge, right? Where's the line between understanding context and then, kind of spreading these harmful stereotypes?
You've got a great point there, and that really gets to the core of the problem.
Yeah.
The article digs into three main reasons why ChatGPT had this hiccup. First, we got to understand that seared hasn't always just meant smith.
Mm.
Historically, it had a much broader meaning. It covered all sorts of crafts.
Right.
But due to, well, it's complicated, cultural factors, and that includes, possible biases against the traveler community who are often connected to metalwork. The main way people in Scotland understand it now is leaning towards smith.
Oh, wow. So the AI, it's using this potentially skewed data, and it just defaulted to the most common modern understanding, even if that wasn't what the author had in mind. That's fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to the second reason, predictive modeling versus literal translation. You know how LLMs are trained on tons and tons of data,
Yeah.
and they basically learn to predict the sequence of words that's most likely to come next.
So they're not translating word for word. They're trying to figure out the meaning based on the patterns and all the data they've been fed.
Exactly.
Okay. I mean that makes sense, but I can also see how that could lead to these misinterpretations.
Exactly. And that takes us to the third and final point. This one's super important for understanding the challenges that marginalized languages face.
Okay.
The reality is, most of the data used to train these LLMs
Yeah.
come from dominant languages,
Yeah.
like English.
So marginalized languages, they're already at a disadvantage, right from the start. Their unique features, their complexities, they're just not as well represented in the data that shapes these AI models.
You got it.
This brings up some serious concerns about the bigger picture of AI translation, especially for languages that are already struggling. What kind of risks are we actually talking about here?
One of the biggest risks is you could lose those subtle meanings, the nuance of the language.
Yeah.
AI just naturally wants to simplify things. It looks for patterns, makes predictions, based on what's statistically most likely to happen.
So it's kind of like it's streamlining language, taking out the wrinkles maybe.
Yeah, you could say that.
But doesn't that defeat the purpose? I mean, especially with languages that have all this rich cultural and historical context.
You're absolutely right. These languages, they're full of these subtle meanings, these layers of interpretation that an AI just wouldn't get, especially one that's mostly trained on, dominant languages.
Yeah.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole,
Yeah, right.
The AI might force a translation, but it's going to miss something really important along the way.
Yeah. I'm starting to see how this could be a problem. It's not just about misinterpreting these languages. It's like we could actually change them in ways that don't reflect what they really are.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big risk. It's reinforcing biases that already exist, especially ones from colonial history.
Right.
If the data used to train these LLMs is mostly shaped by, dominant cultures,
Yeah.
the AI will inevitably reflect those biases. It might even make them stronger in the translations.
So instead of like bridging cultures, AI translation could actually make the gap even bigger.
That's a real worry. And it shows just how important it is to be careful with AI translation,
Mm.
especially when we're dealing with marginalized languages. But it's not all bad news.
Oh, okay.
The article actually gives some practical advice on how we can handle this whole thing responsibly.
Okay, yeah. What kind of solutions does it offer?
Well, one of the most basic things is transparency.
Okay.
The article really stresses that we need to label AI-generated translations clearly
Right.
so that people know, they're not dealing with something a human understands.
Right. Transparency is always a good place to start. It lets us decide how much we should trust what the AI is saying.
Right?
But what about situations where you really need to understand the nuance? Like we can't just rely on an algorithm for that, can we?
Definitely not. That's where human experts come in.
Okay.
The article's a big advocate for double-checking AI translations with people who are fluent, especially with texts that are culturally sensitive or complicated.
Yeah, that makes sense. We need that human touch, that understanding of all the little things, the unspoken rules of language that an AI might miss.
Right.
But even with humans checking the work, isn't there still a chance that the AI's biases will sneak in? How do you make sure we're not just repeating the same problems, just in a different way?
You're right to be careful about that. And that's why the article emphasizes how important it is to really engage with what the AI produces.
Okay.
Don't just accept the translation as it is. Question it, look into the choices it made, try to understand the logic behind it all.
So we should treat AI translation more as a starting point, a tool that can help us, but not the final word.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
We need to be critical about the information we get. We should always be checking the AI's output against our own understanding and looking for other viewpoints when we need them.
The article also mentions that it's important to push for better training data.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little more?
Well, as we've talked about, how good the data is directly affects how good the translation is. If the AI is learning from data that's biased or incomplete, it's going to repeat those biases in what it produces.
Like the old saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. So the article is calling for a real effort to create data sets that are more diverse, more representative,
Yeah.
ones that really show the richness and complexity of marginalized languages.
That makes a lot of sense. But that sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is.
Who's supposed to take on something like that?
It's something we all need to be a part of: researchers, language communities, tech companies, and people who make policy. It's a big job, but it's a crucial step towards making sure AI translation doesn't just become another way for one language to dominate. We want it to be a force for understanding and inclusion.
I'm glad the article brings up that positive side. It's easy to get stuck on the risks and challenges, but it's important to remember that AI can also be a powerful force for good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that leads to what I think is one of the most important points the article makes: busting the myth that AI is neutral.
Yeah. It's easy to think of technology as being objective, but it's way more complicated than that. Can you break that down for us a bit?
Well, it really comes down to understanding that these AI models are just tools. They're powerful tools,
Yeah.
but they're still tools made by humans. And like any tool, they're going to reflect the biases of the people who made them, their assumptions.
Their priorities.
Exactly.
It makes total sense. We can't just assume an algorithm is somehow neutral or objective. It's going to be influenced by the data it learns from and the people who designed it.
You got it.
The author makes a really interesting point about this by switching between the terms AI and LLM throughout the article.
Hmm.
That's kind of curious. Why make that distinction? I mean, aren't they basically the same thing?
Well, not exactly. By using LLM instead of always saying AI, the author is really emphasizing that these models, they're not really intelligent, like humans are.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, they're complicated algorithms,
Right.
but they're still tools that we've created.
And that we control.
Right.
So it's a way of reminding us that we're still the ones making the decisions.
Yeah.
We haven't handed over control to some all-knowing AI.
Yeah.
It's still up to us to figure out how these tools work, what their limits are, and how to use them responsibly.
Exactly. And that includes being aware of the economic and political stuff that shapes these technologies.
Yeah.
Like, who's paying for the research?
Yeah.
Whose interests are being served? Those are big questions that people don't always think about when they get excited about AI.
Right. It's like anything else. You got to follow the money.
Yeah.
If profit is the main driving force behind AI translation tools, we can't just assume they'll benefit everyone equally.
That's right. We got to be aware that these technologies could be used to make existing inequalities even worse, especially when it comes to language and culture.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've covered a lot, but I think the main takeaway is that AI translation is powerful, it had a ton of potential, but it's not perfect.
Yeah.
We can't just plug in a phrase and expect a perfect translation.
No.
We need more than that.
Yeah, you can't just expect it to be totally accurate and culturally sensitive just like that.
Right.
It takes critical thinking, you know? You got to consider the context and be a little skeptical.
Yeah.
Most importantly, we got to remember that AI translation, it's not just a technical thing. It's tied up with social stuff, cultural stuff, and politics.
It reminds us that technology is never neutral. It always reflects the values and biases of the people who create it and use it. And that means it's on us to make sure that AI translation is used in a way that respects diversity, that promotes understanding, and that gives a voice to those marginalized communities.
Well said. It's about using the power of this tech, but also recognizing its limitations.
Yeah, its potential problems.
Right.
So to everyone listening, as you navigate this increasingly complex world of AI translation, remember to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and always look for different perspectives. The future of language is in our hands, and we have to make sure AI translation is a force for good.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That about wraps up our deep dive.
It does, and what a journey it's been. I hope you found it as fascinating as we did. Like always, we've got links to all the sources and some extra resources in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.